My name is Andre Wannenburg. I'm a senior medical officer and oversee the emergency department.
It's been a crazy sort of couple of 8 or 9 months.
Oh yes.
Give me some words that come to mind when you think back at the past few months. What are some words that jump into your head?
Wow. That's probably what happened this year. It feels like a steep hill that we went over. It sometimes felt overwhelmed, crazy, unreal is probably the right word, unreal feeling. What happened to the world. Also assessment of your own self, and not only in your department but also you as a person, and also I think family-wise it made quite a difference to families, people around you, people that was more affected by what has happened this year, and people that had less been affected by this year. So yeah, that's a funny year.
Yeah. Actually, let's go down that road. What are some of the things that, I'll ask you about your team in a minute, but what are some of the things that you learn about yourself? What are some of those realizations
I think what I've learned about this was how important family is. When it gets tough, how important family around you. And me coming from international area, it probably has a big effect, because all of a sudden you're isolated from the family that you normally see once a year. You don't see them once a year. My wife, for instance, has a father and a mother that's in the 80s. They might be still on earth for the next 5 years. A whole year has been taken away that she couldn't see them. So, and I think there's more than one family like this. One of our doctors here that works in internal medicine, his family is still in Canada. He moved here in March to start working here, and his family was supposed to follow him, and all of a sudden COVID came and they cannot. So he's without his family since March. Christmas is coming. He's not going to see him. His daughter is asking where is he. So this is where family has come for me a real important role. How important family is actually around a person. So that was my experience of individuals that I've talked to.
How's that doctor coping?
Tough. It's a tough way, but talking to him regular. I invited him for Christmas with our house. Says, well, you're not going to have no family, you'll have a family. It's important that he should not be alone. Yes, and that's tough for him, because he says, I have never been without my daughter on a Christmas, and the reality is that his family's not going to be here. So yes, that's tough. Yeah.
Obviously people are different, and different individuals will have, like you said, responded differently. As a team, think about the ED team, how have they responded? What are some of the observations you've made about them as a team in terms of how they've coped or not coped?
A team in the ED is always a team that is prepared for anything. So I felt the whole ED department and all individuals, even though under struggle and situations that we were under the pump quite several times, adapting to what has happened to us was really, really good. From the nursing staff, working extra hours, from the doctors that's doing extra hours, dealing with the situation that we have a relatively small department in space, and juggle it around the COVID that needs isolation, was a challenging situation for us, but everybody adapt to it, practice it, and nobody was resistant to realize that we need to do the best in the situation we are. And I give absolutely credit to each one that was working in ED, from the doctor's perspective as well as the nurses. They were still a great team to work with.
I think back to February and March and talking to the nurses and staff in the hospital, I sensed there was fear and confusion, uncertainty. I guess it's the fear of the unknown. Was there fear in the ED, and how did you, if so, how did you see that evolution? I guess how did you see the evolution over time as sort of things became a bit more normal? How people coped with what was so uncertain at the beginning?
It was also, and you actually, it's definitely when we heard about COVID and the first, the denial phase went, it's not going to hit us. And then reality came. And then how do we cope with that? That's the part of, you say, the fear. And then the system got in place. And I think Bairnsdale, in specific Bairnsdale, took it on board and coped with it and put certain stuff in place. And there was a good team, just not only the ED, but with the ED involved in the whole hospital. Because we are a small hospital, the managing staff was really great by see the forthcoming of what's coming. And we there was aims and it was a team effort. It was not isolated efforts that's coming from the managing staff says you need to do that. They came down and have a chat with us, and we were involved in the planning. And as soon as you start getting involved in the planning part, you start relaxing and say we've got a plan. And as you know, we had a couple of times that we practice and say, okay, if this has happened, how are we going to manage it? The first one was a disaster. The second was a little bit better. The third one was really great. So all that fear became, we're ready for it. We can manage it. And if it comes to us, we know how to do it. And after a while, it becomes natural for us to deal with it in ED.
What were some of the concrete changes that came into the ED as a result of COVID, the things that physically people would notice, but also structural and process changes that you guys had to make?
So one of the main issues was if we're going to be hit by COVID and we have COVID positive patients, and how do we manage them and not spreading the COVID virus? So one of the things we had to do is to have two parts of the ED. So a small ED that's already small, to split it up in two was a challenge to see what is the safe environment that we do. So there were structural changes by putting DOF on, DOF off areas. We have only two rooms that is negative pressure, or one room that's negative pressure. The other one is also an isolation room. And we had to change our way of approaching and using the negative pressure by using the second room as a DOF on and DOF off room. That put a lot of strain on the emergency department. When you have only 7 acute areas and you take 2 out, you decrease your acute area with a third, 30%. So that made a change on, and if you get more than 2 potential risk patients coming in, you're stuck, and the process of dealing with a potential infective patient takes much longer, where you maybe spend 2 or 3 hours to sort out a patient and it can be transferred. It took 4 to 6 hours. So the process, slowed down the process in the ED, made a difference. We also had to change structure of space, because ED is not big. People to rewrite doctors, for instance, the doctors write-up room, we had 4 doctors in one side and 4 doctors on the other side. All of a sudden we need to go down to only 3 space to have enough space between personnel working. So we had to adapt to another room, to, for instance, a write-up room. We also, the nursing staff had to adapt to the dress DOF on and DOF off. We had extra staff to deal with all of a sudden acute influx of people that's coming in. There was a lot of changes that happened to adapt to it.
And it seems like some of those would have been, not such a big deal, and people may be more likely to be able to cope with that change, and whereas other changes I'm imagining were maybe a bit more of a challenge to get over. What's one or two of the things that you can think of that were maybe the hardest for your staff to really, was it the PPE, was it the physical distancing? What were some of the challenges that you think were the toughest for your staff to really get over, and maybe they haven't got over?
If I can recall a couple of times that we had persons that came into the emergency department, and you have two people, especially the nurse and the doctor, that going into that COVID area. I think the hardest was, when you are dealing with a sick patient, you can always take a break and go to the toilet or just have a cup of coffee. Where when you go into that COVID area, we realized after about 2 hours in that area, the people are getting very tired. Working in that environment, you are dressed and you are working at 21 degrees Celsius, but with all this stress, you're actually sweating, and you really get dehydrated, and you don't have any access to any fluids, you don't have access to anything because you're dealing with this patient. You don't want to go doff off, go get some water and doff in, on again, and that made a change for us. So we need to adapt to it and make sure that people don't dehydrate, get fatigue. The couple of times that I was in there, I walked out of there and I said, "My gosh, I'm tired," and I appreciate that when nurses were there for 2 or 3 hours with one patient, they were tired.
Did Voicera make a difference for you guys?
Yes, that's an interesting thing, because when we realized, when we start practicing, I think you were also involved with it, all of a sudden we realized we cannot talk to each other from the outside to the inside. And Voicera were one of the great inventions that came into our ED, and we still use it, because now when a nurse has got a triage patient coming in, she can just call on the Voicera to the SMO that's on the floor, and it's easy accessible. We're still learning how to use it. Some people are using it more often. Some people are, resistant to change. But it's improved our communication, gives it easy access. You easily can find people. But as soon as you get isolation area, that's a brilliant idea.
Two more questions and I'll let you go. One is the community. Obviously the frontline ED nurses would see a lot of this, but how do you feel the people at Bairnsdale are doing? The people that you see presenting to the ED, what's the vibe been like? Has it been increased tensions because of COVID? Have people been more helpful and appreciative? What's the sense you get from the community from what you see in the ED?
I felt the community was working together with us very hard to not overload the hospital. A lot of people that came in that's really sick apologize why they're coming to the hospital. And I said, no. We are here to help. People were apologetic and felt there's more sick people than them. That was, for me, interesting. I think the community was working together. There's the odd ones. You always get the odd one people that are obnoxious and aggressive. But I think there was a lot of psychological stress on a lot of people. People that hadn't had family, mental health, people that's been isolated, older people that's been isolated, put a lot of stress on them. But in general, I felt the community was really adapting to the situation. I think the Australians are great by realize we need to work together. And that's what I've seen over these years working in Australia, that when it's going tough, they stand together. In sport, in any job that needs to be done, it's a stick together and
Demand
get it done.
Escalation,
And
level 1, emergency department. Demand escalation.
as we
level
have
1,
been on a daily basis now. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So a sense of unity and sort of coming together. That's
Absolutely.
Great. So last question. New Year's Eve. Let's say we're almost there. It's almost the end of the year, and hopefully the world will look a bit different by then. You've had your New Year's Eve dinner, and you're sitting down with a whiskey or a glass of wine, and you're reflecting on what's just happened to you and your workplace and your colleagues. I'm guessing that this year you'll feel differently than maybe you did last year just because so much has happened. What will you think? What sort of things will you think about the place that you work and the people that you work with?
Yeah, I think we need to go back in 2019. New Year's Eve 2019, we just sat there and say, what happened to 2019? We had these fires, we had the code yellow, the hospital's electronic system cracked on us, and we thought that cannot happen again. And then we hit 2020, and we thought, okay, so now we're sitting at the end of 2020 and it says, what's happening in 2021? I hope it can only be better. That's all I'm thinking at this stage. I can't think it gets worse. We've learned a lot from 2020. I think we've got stuff in place that's simplicity, because we always talk about hygienes, but hygienes is not only in a hospital, hygienes is worldwide. And we realize that the more cluster people are, the more closer we are, we're spreading sicknesses. And what I've seen over this year, and I look back at this year, COVID maybe was the main sickness that we were dealing with. But we haven't seen the rhinoviruses, we haven't seen the SARS-1, we haven't seen bronchiolitis at kids, we haven't seen the asthmas. It's less. So is it because we are, as community, as the general population, realize we need to be protective of ourselves, be hygienic, and that causes the basic infections that we are seeing has decreased because of what we've learned from COVID. And that's how I reflect and says we've learned a lot. I hope we keep that and protect ourselves as we are doing this year.